So anyway, I am going to talk, hopefully with a lot of discussion and hopefully with feedback that I'll get about this idea of how global justice would be in a participatory socialist society. I'm using the word participatory socialist. Participatory society is fine. I'm using them equivalently today. And in preparing this, sometimes I think it feels so far away from where we are that I get a little bit discouraged. But still, I think it's good to think big, even though we're not talking about something that's going to happen probably in my lifetime. But I'm also going to make comments, and I hope you all do also, on how this should inform our strategy in terms of this view of kind of global solidarity, what used to be called a lot by the communist movement internationalism, which I do like that word too. So I'm going to basically, I put my talk, and I think we're just going to maybe put it for people who came late in the chat again. I'll be following it, but it's, as Michael was telling me, it's way too much, which I always do. So I'll pick some points, including, I think, some important economic concepts that not everybody may know, like terms of trade, and discuss a little bit things like the new international economic order. So, okay, so I'm going to talk, like do a section, or at least parts of it, then stop for discussion, and then move on. Okay, so I guess my general point is that a guiding principle of participatory society globally should be that the quality of life is the same within societies and between societies, right? So whether you live in Mali or Beverly Hills, you should have the same basic quality of life. Yes, so that's the basic principle throughout the talk. And again, defining what quality of life to say should be the same is, probably impossible to say. I'm going to focus a little more on the economic today, but basically, I think you could start by saying that the same standard of living within all societies as a goal to reach to, as a goal. And some societies might decide slightly, higher work week and others less. So there could be some difference. But the idea is everybody's basic needs would be guaranteed in every society. Okay, so I'm going to talk in the talk today basically about how to achieve that, and also toward the end with more discussion, kind of speed of adjustment. How are we talking about reaching it? And the kind of things I'm going to deal with today, I put them on page 1, at least some of these. International trade, which is a major one, climate and environmental justice globally, reparations, technology, migration, borders, debt. Basically, those are the main topics. Okay, so basically, I'm also talking about the social movement. So that's by way of introduction. I'm sorry for the interruption here. So let me start with trade, and then I'll open up for some discussion, okay? So for trade, and some of this is also, I do owe to Robin Hanel, who we've had many discussions of, and he's written about it in a few books, including his last book on economic planning, democracy, economic planning. So basically, the principle is fair and managed trade between countries to further global equality. And we can think of this as demands now, but also more how we'd like to get to. So, this is totally different from now where, globally, right, if each country has pressure, for a race to the bottom in tax rates and wages, work conditions. So the idea of when I'm arguing here about fair trade is that to gain some trade, I'm arguing, I'll say more maybe in discussion, is that trade would continue between countries, or I'll maybe use the word societies, because I'm not sure that it'd be like borders and so on. But the idea is that the gains would go to the poorer country, or let's say the global South country first. Let's begin by thinking of both countries have overthrown capitalism, but there still would be major inequality between nations. So the key concept here is the concept called terms of trade. So I think I'll explain in terms of trade and then open it up. So basically, the terms of trade is the price of a country's exports over the price of a country's imports. And an argument of many kind of left economists is that in the history of capitalism, the terms of trade have moved against countries in the global south. So basically, it's what you're paying for your exports compared to what you're paying for the exports you sell to the imports. So I'll give an example, and then maybe people can ask questions about it. So this is the example. It's on page 2, I believe, of my notes. So if, for example, let's discuss trade between Guatemala and the US. And let's talk about maybe coffee and a health MRI machine. So if, for example, the world price of coffee is $2 a pound and an MRI machine is 200,000, Guatemala would have to sell 100,000 pounds of coffee to buy one machine. Is that clear? Because 100,000 times 2 is $200,000. But if Guatemala received, let's say, $4 for a pound of coffee, and it paid 120,000 for the machine, it would only have to produce 30,000 pounds of coffee to get the machine. So the idea of terms of trade is how much of your imports, how much you have to pay for imports in relation to your exports. Terms of trade. So it's basically how much of your exports you have to sell in order to get imports. And the idea, one of the ideas of people like Prebish, Ralph Prebish, Samir Amin, is that the terms of trade have turned against countries in the global south. The things they buy, the prices have been going up, and the things they're selling, the prices have tended to go down. So they have to sell more and more of their goods to buy an equivalent amount of imports. And this idea of making the terms of trade more equal would say that you would move the terms of trade so countries could pay less for the imports and receive more for their exports. So is there a question on just what terms of trade is before I get back to like discussing it more?
Josephine, you wanted it?
I think in a way, my cynicism with US-based healthcare is tainting my of the example where I just anticipate that the MRI machine might be needlessly inflated, and wondering how we correct for the imports and exports where labor would be equitably valued between, so that there isn't like price gouging between nation states that is needlessly. I just, maybe in the neoliberal context I'm in, I'm like skeptical that the full price of the MRI machine tracks to the labor value that was put into it, and just making sure that you're in this hypothetical scenario, we've neutralized the threat of like patent based price gouging and stuff like that, just because I think that would be part of equitable exchange between that in the scenario. So I just thought I'd put that out there and see how you're accounting for that.
Okay. So anyway, I'll end in a second. Okay, so I'm going to get to patents. Hopefully I'll have less technical problems than I've been having now. I apologize again about that, but I'm going to talk about intellectual property rights and getting rid of those. All I'm saying now, the idea of terms of trade is that most of the gains from trade would go to the poorer country, particularly to both participatory socialists. And it's a really major aspect of kind of the gains of the global north. So the idea of trade is that, let's say there's price in the market, you would lower the price of the goods being imported by the global south countries, and you would increase the price of their exports. And later in the notes, what I have, and I guess I'll mention it now, this, because I did talk about this before, in the idea of the new international economic order, the NIEO, which is somewhere in my notes, this was a proposal by a lot of countries, what people used to call the third world. Now it's called the global south. And it came primarily from Michael Manley from Jamaica, Julius Nyerere from Tanzania. Tito was involved in it. And their demands in the middle of the 70s, when it was after OPEC had gained some power, the idea was that for rather than foreign aid, that countries would gain much more by getting higher prices for their exports and then be able to pay less for their imports. And these were demands at the non-aligned nations conference. It also demands about technology, the right to nationalize foreign investments. But this idea of trade, of getting fair prices for their goods, was a major, major aspect. And then there was some consideration of it, but then when Thatcher and Reagan became leaders in the late 70s, early 80s of Britain and the US, they said it's a non-starter, it's interfering with the market, okay? So that's one example of trying to make the terms of trade fair. And I was arguing between certainly participatory societies, the idea would be there still would be trade. I'm arguing a country like, I put in my notes, a small country like Cuba, 11 million people, which for the sake of this talk, I'm considering like a socialist country, and I know it doesn't fit the participatory socialist ideals, that they would still need to trade. Cuba's 11 million people. They're not big enough to produce everything, and therefore they still would be involved in trade, but be trade where the poorer country received most of the gains. So that was one example I had in my notes. And let me give one more example of kind of an attempt at this. It was the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas. This was set up in the early 2000s, I think 2003, I have it in my notes, the year, where it eventually ends up being about 10 or 11 countries. Bolivia became part of it, Ecuador, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and various smaller countries in the Caribbean. Okay, and the idea again was fair trade between those countries, even the idea of developing a bank and a currency, so sharing technology and fair trade between the countries, like the most famous being trade between Cuba and Venezuela. Here, barter was used more than actually money, where it was basically oil from Venezuela was traded for like doctors, medical facilities in Venezuela. So those are some examples in what I'm talking about. So let's open up here a little bit, this idea of fair trade, what the principle is, and what I'm arguing for here. And let me add one more comment while people are thinking of asking anything. Fair trade, which people often think of fair trade as, for example, I have in my notes, 25% of the coffee in the UK is now fair traded. And I think that's a way of, thinking of it now, of basically that fair trade movement is saying that workers are guaranteed some health guarantees. For example, you wouldn't have right now in fair traded coffee, like people dying because it's heat climate, wouldn't have to work in climate, would have access to water, as well as getting wages that would pay a livable wage. That's the idea of a movement on fair trade, but it's a relatively limited, and it's a complicated because often it means prices are much higher for the fair traded good for people who are buying them. Travis?
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, I mean, without getting into too much deal, just like is it possible? I guess I'm wondering how the prices get determined to have fair trade, and like, is it possible to, like, how accurate can you make those prices? Like, I get you would, like you're saying, you would decrease the price of imports for less developed countries and increase the price of their exports, right? But like, how much either direction, you know?
So, I mean, this is a question I would have. So, later on, I'm talking about maybe having like the par polity, which some people are familiar with on a national level. I would extend this to a global level, right? And that's, if I get to that, I will. So I don't know, because Robin Hanel, right, when he's writing, he says more than 50% of the gains of trade would go to the poorer country. okay? But there still would be difference. So I guess a question I have, and I don't really have, I mean, one question I have speed of adjustment. The more the terms of trade favor the poor country, the more you move to global equity, saying that basically they make all the gains from trade. So, but there'd have to be some kind of negotiations. I don't know if anybody's idea. So just saying most of the gains of trade go to the poor country, how you would do that, I don't. There'd probably have to be some kind of negotiations around it with the general principle that most go to the poor country. And see, the more they go to the poor country, the quicker the speed of adjustment. Does anybody have any, I don't know, ideas of how you would do that? Is it clear what I'm asking? How, just saying that most of the gains in the terms of trade should favor the global South country, but where, do they get 90% of the gains from trade or they get 55%? There's a very big difference. Michael?
Yeah, I also don't think it's obvious how you even figure out what the gains are. From different perspectives, the gains turned out to be different, I think. I've never understood this. However, there's a simple approach and then a utopian approach, and at various points in time, you'd have something in the middle, I guess. So if you have a country that's got participatory planning on the one hand, and a country that doesn't or is much poorer on the other hand, you could look at participatory prices, that is the prices for the things that are being exchanged in the participatory country, and then you could look at market prices, and you use whichever set of prices. This is the simplest solution, I think. It yields more benefit for the poorer country. So that's a simple solution. A more aggressive solution would be you don't just do that. You then, like Peter was saying, have this sort of guideline about how you're supposed to divide up the benefits, and you do that. So you basically have the exchange, you see what the benefits are, and you give the greater percentage to the poorer partner in the trade. And the ultimate solution is to have some kind of participatory planning internationally. So instead of there being market price, I mean, right now we have markets in each country and we have markets internationally. Well, if you have participatory societies, you have participatory planning in each country. But since you still have lots of capitalist countries, you have markets internationally as well. So the long-term solution is participatory planning across the world, I would think. Go on.
So what I put in my notes, Michael and everybody else, okay, so it's clear what terms of trade are. It's just priced right, and if you can get more for your exports, you do better. If you pay less for your imports, you can import more. And what I argued, and I do all the different cases, but let's say to begin with, both the global South country and the global North country, they both are participatory societies. Okay, I argue in my notes that you begin with the participatory prices. That's the beginning point, because that makes sense. And then you adjust the prices from there. Yeah. So it's more, but I'm saying you don't use the market prices at all. You use the participatory prices, not the world market prices. And you'd use participatory prices and then you adjust from there. That seems to me that would be the best for both countries.
Peter, what are the participatory prices? The United States is trading with Guatemala. If Guatemala has a participatory economy and the United States has and they both have participatory planning, they don't have the same prices.
I know, but then you adjust exactly. But then you would adjust those prices. I see what you're saying. That's a good point. They begin with different prices too.
Yeah. It's not only that. I don't even understand the concept terms of trade, and I'm supposed to be an economist, but I don't get it. If the United States is selling fruit or something, which it might be to some country, let's say it's trading with India, and India is providing cars, or India is providing computers or something, and the United States is providing, in other words, the United States might be providing something that costs much less. That doesn't mean the terms of trade are in India's advantage. That doesn't mean India is accumulating more of the benefit. The real issue is here is the weaker or poorer country accruing more of the benefit from the trade. That's your principle, and I think that makes sense. So that's what we're looking at. I think we could almost stop there. I mean, in other words, that's what we want to have until there's equity, right? So until there's equity, you give more of the benefit to the poorer trading partner so as to move toward equity. But how you do that is a whole nother story. I don't, you know.
I think Josephine is next, and then Selena, and then Travis.
Thank you. What comes to mind with this question, sort of the principles that I heard put out initially, which is this idea of quality of life equity across different, just the global international regions, and how we materially facilitate that with some sort of consistent system that could be reliable. And I think like the macro level of using like nation states that are maybe been systematically exploited with the progression of imperialism and capitalism, and trying to get some sort of like almost a reparations type effect so that we can kind of level out the playing field a little bit. In my mind, within these communities, right, the imbalances within the communities when it comes to quality of life measures, you almost have to account for what are the human rights violations taking place across these contexts, regardless of nation state identity, and where do you have to invest to get that same quality of life experience, especially for people with disabilities that have been socially ostracized, that are having more egregious human rights violations. Like, we would have to start there and account for what that would take to bring up that baseline before we could determine like those prices or things. So I just am an advocate of looking at more functional outcomes rather than going by the numbers, because I feel like numbers can obscure where you would want to maybe define these like human rights, operationalize what human rights and these outcomes are. And then we have to collectively look at what the resources are and what the allocation would be to actually bring the human rights baseline up, almost as a precondition.
I want to make one brief comment and have the other two people go. So in terms of what I'm trying to talk about, I'm both talking about a strategy that considers primarily the global and moving to equity, right? And it's not just numerical, it's move to equity both within countries and between countries. And I'm gonna problematize the whole question of countries before the end of the talk, because I'm not sure if countries even make sense, but I'm thinking, Josie, in terms of both as a strategy and as an outcome. So thinking about where we are today, hopefully there'll be some insights to strategy, but also where we want to go, both within and between countries. Other hands? Go ahead, Sabina. Sabina, you want to go? And then Travis.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to add to what I heard Peter and Michael say, although I'm still trying to kind of get my head around all of this. But it seems to me that in a participatory economy, because we're relying on indicative prices, and indicative prices includes thinking about externalities, right? So one of the ways, Peter, to kind of address like what you posed initially, like, yeah, we need to make sure that they pay less for the price of imports and that their exports are worth more. Well, one way that we can use Paracon to think about all this is, yeah, if you think about the fact that producing something like coffee probably has huge externalities. And so, and also the fact that a lot of these basic commodities that are grown in the global South you cannot grow coffee in Seattle, right? You can't grow cocoa, you can't grow sugar. Like so many of these commodities actually rely on the environment, the soil, the blah, 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 all the conditions that you need to grow coffee in Guatemala, right? So maybe there's a way to think about the environmental costs and benefits involved here. And that's a way to justify like, yeah, we should actually be paying a lot more for coffee than we do. And also think about the pollution costs from transporting bags of coffee and so on, right? So I feel like that could be one way that indicative prices could capture the fact that actually we've been underpaying for a lot of this stuff from the global south. So that's one piece. And another piece is tied to what Josephine, you were saying, that maybe it's also about tagging on a little something for reparations, right? We know that the global south's been colonized by the global north for many, many years, et cetera, et cetera. And so one way to think about equity is when we're paying for coffee, maybe we like have to pay like a extra amount for reparations. I don't know. These are just some thoughts.
Thanks.
I don't know, Travis, if you want to go or you change your mind and then.
Well, Ken has his hand up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm good. I don't need to.
Okay, then Ken, go ahead.
One thing I would put into this is that in terms of, maybe this tags to this, I'm not sure, but we're talking about what would be benefits to people in the global south. Partly to get consent for this here, you'd need to also make an argument that, a good chunk of people here, like people in more or less who are working class in North America, in Britain, in Europe, would gain something out of it too. I mean, particularly, this is more maybe North American, would be arguing that this kind of change, participatory things, ways it could be beneficial to them. One, it would get them out of what was termed the race to the bottom, out of the whole having to, being pressed to get their wages, accept their wages being held down or driven down, which is a lot of people are rejecting anyway. It would reduce the number, potentially reduce the amount of funds spent on the military, which go to sort of enforcing unjust situations rather than just getting rid of the unjust situations. So there are things that wouldn't have to be enforced, just for whatever it's worth, putting those factors and things that might be part of the argument that we would make.
For sure. Yeah, I argue that the thing of saying people's lives would be worse, including in the first world or global north, is not something I'm arguing for. The quality of jobs would be much better, or some of the things that you mentioned. Before I got into the trade, I heard everybody said, I liked a lot of the ideas. A few things. I'm not saying, again, particularly thinking of food, that basically, you should import stuff that's cheaper. I did put again in my notes, which I hope up now, the idea of food sovereignty, that very much tied to an international called Via Campesina, which is an international group of farm workers and small farmers. And the idea is that people should have control over the food. It doesn't mean you don't import, like Sabina mentioned, the coffee, but people have control over the food. They guarantee decent wages, decent health conditions, and that food and growing food locally is part of people's culture. So I'm not saying, just continue with trade, always get things at the cheapest price, even considering, the fair trade stuff. But I do think, I don't know, probably this group's not that controversial, but often I hear people say, there shouldn't be trade. The economics terms autarky of just people should produce things themselves. And I think an important concept in economics, not that I'm into most economic concepts, is the idea of economies of scale. For many goods, it's cheaper to produce them in large quantities. So again, I'll use Cuba as an example, right? Or Nicaragua, to think of a country of like 6 million people that they should produce everything themselves makes no sense. It's much cheaper to produce some goods, even environmentally, even considering transport costs, and producing things in a large enough level so that economies of scale have relevance. Economies of scale mean the more you produce, the less the resource cost and the amount of labor you need per item. Okay. I think I'll move on for the trade. Is there any other comments on the trade stuff? In my notes, okay, I have, ideas of what about if people look at them later, if one society participates and the other one isn't, et cetera. And the thing Savina mentioned, which Lonnie had also mentioned to me, the idea of like maybe a tax or some goods could just be like a form of foreign aid, be given to countries at no cost until there was equality. I'm looking at the questions. Okay. So I guess this question of surplus that Josie and Matisse answered. Yeah, I think basically you can think of surplus as producing, people, let's go back, even in Marx talks about this a lot in the Critique of the Gotha program, even in a socialist country, a communist with a small c, where workers control the economy, you would use more than is needed to, for your basic income. And then you would have societal decisions. How should people use that surplus? Should they use it to invest in new technologies, maybe in more schools, where would you use that surplus? So the question is, who in class societies, the ruling class, whether it's the slave-owning class, the capitalist class, they don't produce the surplus, but they control it, and they gain it. The idea is that surplus is socially controlled. I guess that's what Matisse was saying Matisse, in your comments there. Is that clear, in terms of the question?
I'm just excited to learn more.
Okay.
I'm really interested in it makes me curious what indigenous context of trade might have looked like in the past, and what we can learn from that too. What I worry about then is like where not the labor being exploited, but the land and the ecology may be getting pushed to different balances. So I'm just wondering, like, how do we keep that in balance? These are just very fruitful questions and complex. I know there's no easy answers here.
Well, that's the idea. When Savina and others were mentioning the indicative price, the idea is all of those costs are considered as part of those goods. Okay, so my next section in my notes was the idea of information technology, cancellation of debt, and reparations. So a few points in opening it up. And I know the trade stuff, we had as many questions as answers. So the idea is then that there'd be like a technology commons, right? So at first I said, anyway, the idea is that the technology development information would be something that would be shared. And just that answers some of your comments about the patents, that things information would be shared, they'd be available to anybody at no cost. And I would also argue transfer of capital from richer to poorer societies. And again, even if in the current world now, a lot of things that we're talking about now are things to demand in the present period, even though we obviously won't achieve most of those. I did put here in terms of reparations, a big demand, which the United States finally said they would consider a little bit the latest COP meetings, was the idea of loss and damages. And I think we can consider loss and damages in terms of all of the carbon that countries have produced, CO2, as a form of climate reparations. So in terms of thinking about demands now, supporting climate reparations seems to me a very important and positive one. And one more thing about the reparations And this actually comes from Michael. Let me talk about this, and then I'll get to the immigration in a second. Okay, so one of the things I think Michael and some comments he made was saying we can think of reparations, and this is usually thought of like in terms of slavery in the United States or globally, colonization, is reparations is to pay for past crimes that have been committed, right? The human costs of reparations to people losing their land, their lives, slavery, institutional racism, to pay for the past. And then as I wrote, so that's one way of thinking about reparations. Another way is thinking about reparations to cause equality. In other words, given, let's say, the difference of people's lives in different countries, that you can think of reparations to cause global equality or global equity. I don't think they're all that different, but they are somewhat different conceptually. So that's one question. Is it to pay for the past or is it to create equality in the future? Second one is who receives them, who receives the reparations in this. So who receives them? So for example, in the US context, a really major, brilliant activist, Randall Robinson, in the book, The Debt, which again is in my notes, he argued, he who died recently, he argued for reparations for Black America, but he argued not reparations to individual people, but to communities, like poor Black communities, like smaller school size, maybe no interest loans for housing, more health care. So is reparations, does it go to individuals? Does it go to some kind of social thing or organization? And then, of course, and then the third question is, well, that's two more questions. The third question, reparations, and I'm talking about globally now. The third question is who pays? Is it governments, corporations, like more and more, coming out about, for example, universities like Georgetown being involved, in having slaves, selling slaves, and so on, Georgetown University in DC. So who pays the reparations? And then I guess the fourth maybe question, which I didn't really put in my notes, is it a worthwhile strategy to pursue? And let's talk about maybe for today on a global level, like the loss and damages, other forms of reparations for colonialism. It's been a major demand in a lot of like global meetings around racism. It's been the issue of reparations. So I don't know, does anybody want to make comments either on the debt, canceling global debt? That was in the WTO protest in '99, it never got the attention, but canceling third world debt was a really major issue. Dennis Brutus, a very well-known South African activist, was really a leader in this movement for canceling the debt. So any questions about the technology or comments people like to add about the debt, reparations before I go on to immigration? But I am interested in any comments on that.
Added one in the chat.
Okay.
Travis?
Well, I want to say I really like communities rather than individuals, because if you think like about, say a Black person who's like a physician or something, and they're rich, like they don't really need it. Also, you think about like if you give it to a community, one of the problems you might say is like, okay, well then there's probably some white people in the community or other, whatever. But then it's I don't know. I think it's still good because you're giving it to who needs it, like the communities that are struggling. But at the same time, I don't really know how to phrase it, but like yeah, I really like that idea. And as far as debt, I guess one question that, say, someone who supports capitalism would ask, so I'm just gonna play devil's advocate, is if you cancel debt, right, then people like countries might expect that in the future, so they might borrow beyond their means, and after you cancel it, they might borrow beyond their means to an extreme degree. We're making a situation where you keep canceling it. So I was just wondering what people think about that.
Let me just answer between that and then Josephine next. So I guess with global debt, I said that was has been a pretty big part of a lot of movements in the global South, and there's been a lot of conference around it and demands on it. And some countries have done part of it, like Argentina under the Kirchners. They said they offered to pay 25% of the debt, and that was accepted. Is that what if the country receiving it is not a participatory society? Let's say it's a capitalist, really unequal society. Still, by canceling the debt, it gives social movements in those countries the possibility of winning demands more easily for education, jobs, healthcare, environmental protections. So even if the country is not a participatory society, it does give them more opportunities to populations of those countries. And then secondly, I think when you're dealing with, let's say, these ideas between a participatory society and a non-participatory society, and let's say the non-participatory society is a poorer one, as much as you can channel some of these ideas of like resources, reparations toward communities, movements that are involved in struggle, and maybe less going through a kind of repressive capitalist state, I think that's another thing to think about in the current period. Okay. Josie?
I just have a comment that's somewhat inspired by a discussion I saw AOC having last night, and just thinking about the tragedy of the commons, which I think is kind of what takes place when we have public resources that then can be imbalancedly exploited by an antisocial entity. And I think that part of the reparations conversation, or untraditional or like unexpected mechanism, is when we do hold white collar crime accountable, and we do build in counterbalances that don't allow white collar type criminal behavior, like international theft at this level. I think finding mechanisms to stop that from recurring and recycling. It's kind of like sometimes we get into like victim blaming or something. They're like, okay, if we just invest in the victim, then the crime will stop. But it's like, no, take the pimp out of business. Like, we can recover a lot of resources and assets of what's been hidden from how the commons has been exploited by these things. So I think that that's also a hidden realm of resources, is when you find where people are hiding the money, and introducing it back to the commons. So that's, I don't know if that's a distinct point. I mean, a distilled point, but I will stop talking now.
But that's, I like the idea, but it's also very much a question: do we have the political power, which is a lot of this kind of missing? Do we have the political power to make that happen, right? And that's the challenge.
I think that's true with all of these questions, right?
No, definitely. I was saying that exactly. You're right, Matisse.
So touching on this, how to actually intervene or disperse these extra costs, I think I would caution against, trying to, like run the other society, so, you would give these extra resources, to groups you select, and, in ways you select, and they have to reorganize in the way you want. I think this is, not the correct approach. I mean, the damage is done, the northern societies owe, and I don't think, the other societies, even if they're not participatory, should be like required, to reorganize according to what we like before we give them whatever we owe them, we should just do it. So I would caution against this, thinking who to give it so it would have the best effect. It's their society, they should decide.
Yeah, I mean, I mainly agree. I mean, I was thinking when you were talking, Matisse, is how, and this has been true a lot since basically the turn of the century, since 2000, where it's called highly indebted poor countries of basically canceling or reducing the debt, but in return for basic structural adjustment, meaning that countries, and this has come a lot from the World Bank, from the US, where countries are forgiven their debts if their income is below a level, but then they basically have to privatize the economy, follow more neoliberal principles. So it's written as reform, but I think that's a really important caution for us.
Yeah, maybe just to continue on that note, because you can easily turn then another countries again into colonies if you make such and such demands. And what you just said, Peter, if we just take a look at Kosovo, who is receiving huge amount of money from the US, but for a certain reason, right? So they are basically American colony.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good example. So I want to turn, before I have some questions for everybody to answer, let me just briefly talk about, and again, it's not something, it's more of a discussion than I have the answers to, kind of immigration and issue of nations. Okay. So, and I've said this before in a talk I gave before, it seems to me that there really is no kind of philosophical reason for preventing people moving across borders, right? That seems like basic human beings should have the right. And I know the last time I did a talk like this, I argued this friend of mine who lived half a mile from the border is Juarez, one of the most violent cities in Mexico, in El Paso, Texas. And why should your life be different because you're born, 2 kilometers south or north? So I think the idea that people should be allowed to move is very basic. I also like, in terms of this, and this comes from the book, it's both a good title and a good book by David Bacon, and again, it's in my notes. It's called The Right to Stay Home. And the idea is, if the assumption is that people have lives that are, they can survive, lack of violence, women having rights for equality, not war gangs, and most people are not going to cross borders. So people have the right to move, but as we move more toward a globally equal society, I don't think it would necessarily mean there'd be more migration. So, but I think that should be a basic principle, as the right to stay home, but also the right to move, and pushing for programs that do both of that. And it's very hard in terms of the issue of fascism and authoritarianism. It seems that the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee is very much part of that program. And I think even though I was happy in Spain, the elections last week, the Vox, the right-wing group, the major anti-immigrant group, didn't do very well. So that was hopeful, but still, it is a real growth over the world. And, I don't know how to combat it. I do think, and this ties to what Ken was saying earlier about working class people here not losing. It's very important in all the strategy we push it on refugee justice, immigrant justice, which I think should be a key part of real utopia in this period, that we also fight against austerity measures. So it isn't like a zero-sum game that people here lose because you have immigrants coming, that at the same time we push for stuff like universal basic income, in the United States, healthcare for all, living wage, employer of last resort. So it isn't one, people saying, immigrants are the cause of our problems. I know that's not a sufficient solution, but it does seem that we should be supporting moves toward the right to move. And saying that, and it's the other thing I'll say, and then maybe again open it up for a few comments on this. What about this question of nations? And I mean, certainly boundaries are not sacrosanct, see, like Savina's here, I often mentioned, the house where her family is from. In a short period, it was kind of went from an English colony to India to Pakistan to Bangladesh, because boundaries changed of what India was. Or we have two people here. Slovenia used to be Yugoslavia, right? And so boundaries do change, but should they even be countries? And I'm interested that sometimes in the notes I gave, I used the word societies. I do think there are some things that are distinct areas. So I do think the idea of having societies should continue. But what does it mean when people have? I think we have to argue. Not only can people move, but they have full rights. Think of maybe, even though I know it's more in theory than practice, within the European Union. Certainly not from outside the European Union, but the way people can go from country to country. There still are countries, but people, if you move, like a friend of mine who moved from Spain to Greece about 12 years ago, she still has full rights in Greece and just could, move, and she's thinking of moving it again. So anyway, I guess the question about immigration in terms of RU and global justice, the question of immigration and the question of countries' borders, right? Because again, a lot of, people who call themselves anarchists, they think there shouldn't be nations at all. And I'm saying people would have all the rights in moving, but there still would be nations. So I'm interested in any kind of thoughts on either the immigration question, what it means for us in terms of global justice, both now and in the future, as well as the question of nations. I know these are pretty big questions.
So I was going to ask, like, on the open borders question, without even like talking about what's moral, but just on an economic point of view, if you have a participatory economy, when more people enter the economy, it doesn't really like affect, right? Whereas like in capital, they can take jobs or whatever. I know like a lot of that's a myth or whatever, but it wouldn't really matter in a participatory economy, right? Because if you have more people, you basically, I don't know, it just doesn't have any negative effect. Possibly even if you have more people and you can, like you're saying, have more economy to scale and stuff, everyone would just kind of work less essentially because it'd be more efficient. Is that kind of correct, or would there still be negatives of people coming into the country?
Okay, so in this, I'll just try to answer that, and then Matisse next. So in terms of studies I've looked at, and I do mention again in my talk, in terms of the US, given the kinds of immigration we're having, the numbers now, which is still relatively small compared to the country, and I think it's larger in some European countries. You think what percent of the population is foreign born? It's about 15% here, foreign born, which is pretty high, but still it's 15%. Most of studies have shown it doesn't lower wages here, with changing nothing else. And the main guy's a guy named David Card, who won the Nobel Prize from University of California, Berkeley. What he did, which I think isn't a great proof, but he compared cities with high migration compared to cities with low migration into it. And the cities with high immigration into it, wages went up more than cities where there was low migration. Of course, immigrants went partly there because wages were rising. So I do think beyond a certain point, if you didn't do much, it probably would lower wages. And another argument is that, school costs, but I think those should be taken federally or, in terms of the cost there. So I do think you need other programs. But I think certainly the kind of common sense, the Gramsci, that in terms of the conventional wisdom is immigration lowers wages and health conditions here. And I'm arguing that that's why we need to really push for programs that benefit everybody, universal programs. Okay.
Matisse.
Yeah, I wanted to touch maybe both on the nation and the immigration thing. I think when you're talking about like reasonable amounts of immigration, it shouldn't be any problems but there are countries now, you know, where more than 50% of the population are refugees, basically, you know, like Lebanon. And of course, you know, there, you know, more people create more pressure on nature, on, you know, they take up more space. You need to build the apartments, you need to build all the other infrastructure. And, you know, it may conflict with kind of trying to preserve, I don't know, biodiversity or whatever. But that would be like in extreme cases, you know, it's not like it's likely to happen to a lot of places. You know, but when you're a country surrounded by other countries who are, you know, basically at war, you know, periodically, you know, you have a lot of people coming in. So I don't think we should just blindly have a, like, okay, there will never be any limit or condition or whatever, you know, but to the point, you know, to what's expected reasonably, you know, I think it shouldn't be any problem for people to just come in when they can, you know, as long as the other rule, you know, that Peter said, the right to stay home, you know, to have like a normal place to live where you are should be observed. But also the you know, the nation, I mean, you know, I think because the word nation is so loaded, you know, but you know, there should be like physical limits to the organizational structure that kind of governs a society. You know, you can't just have I mean, because if you have like a system, then people within it have to play by the system's rules, you know, and of course, you know, at some place, you know, people don't want to, and they want to play by some other rules, you know, and that would be like the border of the society. Now, do you call this, you know, a nation? I don't know. It makes no sense. You know, a lot of countries don't have like one nationality in it anyway. So I wouldn't, but certainly, you know, a society would have some sort of borders. You know, when you come in, you know, these are the rules now. You know. Because otherwise, you know, in a world where we have like a participatory society and other societies are capitalist, you know, we can't just have them come in, you know, as if there's nothing, you know, set up a for-profit shop or something, you know, and then, you know, ignore the externalities and make trade, you know. So we would certainly have to have some sort of border, you know, from where on, you know, the new rules apply. But also, you know, I really don't like, you know, how borders of countries are fixed now, you know, now, because it's almost like countries have rights, but people don't, you know. So, you know, when like people want to join another society, you know, or create their own, you know, they should be allowed to, but also join another society, you know. So I don't know, there's a standing joke in Slovenia, no, we should declare war on Sweden and immediately surrender, you know, and maybe they'll annex us. You know, but I mean, there is a kernel of truth in there, you know. You're sometimes stuck in a society that really doesn't operate on the principles that you like, or doesn't treat you because of, you know, racist reasons, right? You know, and you would rather join another society, you know, and I think this should be like totally allowed, you know. Yeah.
But then, you know, just I see Josephine's question, but in terms of you saying it is a hard question, particularly if you have only a few countries that participate, right? Like from contacts with quite a few people in both sub-Saharan Africa, in most of the countries, not everyone, and in Central America. Many different people who don't know each other have told me over the years that the majority of people in those countries would leave if they could. And see, it ties to your question too. And if we're talking about only a few countries are open, that does create some difficulties, because and it's tied to what Travis said too, the numbers can become so large, right, that it does really have major impacts, particularly if the countries are open, but we don't have the right to stay home, you know, meaning much. So I think you're raising some of that. I guess with the borders, I think you can't really justify closing them, and hopefully there's enough change going on in many places. Isn't everybody going to one country? But I don't know, I think you're raising some really hard questions. See, people who haven't spoken, Lizzie, do you want to add anything to the conversation, or anybody else?
Happy to let
I think
somebody else
Josephine, yeah.
go first. I can go after.
No, it's okay. If anyone wants to speak, still.
Which can then Josie, maybe.
Yeah, Josephine.
Okay, and I'll make sure to make space for someone else too. I really appreciate this line of thinking, and it prompts me to think about some of my ancestry that I've been exploring in relation to Iceland and Scandinavian cultures of going back to the deep history prior to 600 AD. Those communities got really impacted by a series of volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sunlight for decades. And so in my mind, I feel like destitution can be so dangerous when you're fixed in a land mass that can't produce what's needed to care for people. That historic context has helped me understand kind of how Viking society developed and how it's kind of unfolded. I have Icelandic ancestry, and in the 1850s, it was, I guess, one of the first settlements in the United States to ever leave Iceland. That setup was part of my lineage, and I think a lot about why they might have left and where things came from there. But the interesting thing about Iceland is that the land can change overnight, just like most other volcanic islands, and the question of what borders are in the context of ecological climate crisis is necessarily going to shift. And I think if we have communities that don't have access to productive land or a means of moving forward, I can't see why you wouldn't choose to go like a Viking route. And I think what is interesting about this question is getting to a place where we just fast forward to proposing the ideal trade negotiations that would come after people adapt to a Viking type society to try to enforce a favorable trade relationship. Can we just go there without going the Viking route is kind of what I think you're proposing. And I do wonder if there's any wisdom that some of the Scandinavian cultures might offer us about how to navigate climate crisis and having an alternative to violence.
Just briefly, I know this is directly responsive, but I mean, one thing I should have said is, in thinking of refugee justice, I think the idea of climate refugees is really a central issue that's going to grow and that we need to be in solidarity. And that's part of, I think, the argument. I'm just going to also say, Josie, this is an aside. I was looking the other day of unionization in countries. Iceland's over 90% of the workforce is unionized, by far the highest in the world.
Help me bring it here. I want my presence here to be a gift to Turtle Island. Let's let that be an export, please.
Who's good?
I was thinking if we have a participatory society, and then there are countries outside our society that are capitalist, and if people want to, for example, move here because life would be better in participatory society, but then would want to, because the life for them would be better, but they would still want to earn more money, then it would be allowed maybe in participatory society, and they would want to establish a capitalist firm outside of our society, in a capitalist society, and get the money there, like people are doing now, when they're establishing firms in tax havens, and it's completely normal, and each country allows that. So would we allow that or not? Probably not, right? If someone, moved from a capitalist country to our participatory society, because life would be much better, but they would want to still establish a capitalist firm in another country.
But they couldn't.
Or would we want to will we prevent this?
Yeah, I think they couldn't, right? Because of the rules, the laws. They could. Travis, I'm going to move on because of the time, okay? Okay, so I want to leave with some questions before. I have a section in my notes on global governance. And concept which I haven't really, well, let me say first, I think there clearly would be a need for some kind of governance beyond this. Let's say we'll use the word society rather than nation, around climate, the oceans, maybe a security force, global self-defense. And one idea I had, which I haven't really thought out how it would work, I put it in my notes. I called it global parpolity, right? Parpolity is a thing that Steve had that I think this should exist both on a societal level, the idea of participatory planning and the various other parts of like the nested councils, but also on a global level, the idea of some kind of participatory governance at a global level. So I just wanted to mention that. And then at the end of my notes, if I can find them here, I had a few questions, and I wanted to leave people with these questions. And let's finish up the discussion now. Let me just see if I can find these questions here in my notes. Okay, so these are, I had 6 questions at the end, and let me just, okay, we already talked about the nations and open borders, so I don't know unless people say more. The question, of course, is how rapidly. Okay, so let me read the other question. This is at the end of my notes. I'm going to read from my notes. Okay, how does our organizing and acting for global equity and justice connect to our vision of participatory society, to our demands, which movements and government support? And I put really Utopia needs to make the kind of global solidarity a larger part of our discussion. And similarly, the climate justice, how does our advocacy for climate justice and environmental justice connect to our vision toward participatory socialism? And what can we learn from the climate justice movement, like direct action, environmental justice? Okay, so that's the second question. I'll just read the questions, then open up for anybody to answer any of them. A third question is forms of and reasons for reparations, which I have mentioned. Another question which I think is I didn't really discuss is the idea of what is self-determination, and particularly about indigenous societies in terms of participatory society. Could they fit in? How much of the principles do they need to uphold to be part of this? And then finally, which I mentioned but haven't really discussed, is this idea toward global equity in terms of trade, et cetera. How fast should the speed of adjustment be, right? Are we talking, slow, fast in terms of capital transfers, terms of trade, open borders in our strategy? What do people think about, if it's so slow, it doesn't mean a lot. If it's so fast, there's no support. So the question of speed of adjustment in terms of our program, what we advocate for, et cetera. So those are some of the questions, right, about self-determination, speed of adjustment, the form of reparations, if people want to talk more about the borders, and and basically the whole climate stuff in terms of what we're talking about. So let me just open up and encourage particularly people with any of these questions. Again, they're in the notes who haven't spoken up much, but we have like maybe 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes to discuss them. So just thoughts generally about any of the questions I've raised.
Joe, go ahead.
Is that me?
Yes.
Let me see if I can get this out. First of all, Travis, I'll answer your chat by email when this is over. My chat doesn't work. I can't work it. My Zoom screen has some malfunctions. So this is very difficult. It's also been difficult for me to follow this discussion because whereas all of you are looking for answers to questions, the first question I'd ask is, how does life organize? How is life organized on planet Earth? We are products of the organization of life and need to organize in the pattern that works, the pattern that life uses, that we must consciously employ, whereas the rest of life just automatically does life. So Travis asked me a question about, I think, Copper's Triangle. I say the Copper's Triangle models the organization of all living systems on planet Earth. No one has ever engaged Copper's triangle. This is extremely frustrating, as it is to try and work in a technological internet that I do not understand and cannot adequately use. So that's my dilemma. But I think that the dilemma of the human species is that we have this analytic reductionist cognition, which shows life as a collection of separate things, whereas it is not. All life is interrelated. And I swear that Copper's triangle presents this. But so let me leave Copper's triangle and this clumsy attempt to state what I know. But what I'm trying to say is that rather than answer questions in the virtual world as to what somebody would do in the future, we need to look to the organization of life, establish the organization of life, and then let the people in the future make their decisions according to that model. Have I made any sense whatsoever? Well, I've tried.
Thank you.
I just want, what I was asking too, Joe, is I just am wondering if you want to look it up. Is it Copper's triangle? Is it copper, the metal triangle? Or
it's a three-part reductionist simplified model of life's organizational pattern that all matter.
Just how to spell.
Pardon me?
I just mean how to spell it, because I looked it up and couldn't find anything about it.
It's CAPRA, Fritjof Capra, the theoretical physicist who became living systems theorist.
All right, I got
that.
That was my question. Sorry, it's a little off topic.
But I'm looking forward to getting together with you by email. I'm going to try at least. I've got your email. You poor devil.
And I got distracted by my technological problems at the beginning, but I am interested. So I hope it wasn't too scattered, because that really threw me for a loop at the beginning. But anyway, I'm interested in other comments about any of the questions I raised, anything else? Michael, go ahead.
Maybe just one thing. All the way back at the beginning, you laid out the principle, I suppose you could call it, or the goal or the value or whatever, which was equity between different societies and within them. So we know about within. How do you do between? What does it even mean? And so I'm thinking about that since then, and I think there maybe is a simple answer to that. If exploitation is that you receive less than for how long you work, how hard you work, and the onerousness of the conditions under which you work, which is what participatory economics, participatory society says, then what does it mean to say Guatemalan material well-being has attained the same level as, let's say, material well-being in a participatory society, United States? It would mean that the income claims of citizens in Guatemala are like those in the United States. That the income of Guatemalans was in the same norm, that is, for duration, intensity, and onerousness, which is to say also that their buying power would be comparable, the same. It would vary, but it would only vary because they work longer or less longer, et cetera, et cetera. And then all the rest of what is being discussed, I think, because it's been mostly economics, not entirely, but mostly, is about efforts to move in that direction, right? And the efforts to move in that direction, the trade efforts or the reparations efforts, well, for reparations, it gives you a clear answer. You don't put money someplace because 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 500 years ago, they were exploited. You put the money there, not money, you put buying power, you put material well-being there to move up people's material well-being to be equitable. That's the goal. It's a positive goal, not a punishment goal, not a retribution goal. The moving between borders, I don't know, when you were talking about it and the group was talking about it, And I'm sort of thinking to myself, well, in a participatory society, we say there should be free entry and exit from communities. On the other hand, you can't just join a community by saying I'm in it. There are criteria and there are et cetera. And it seems to me it's pretty similar internationally. There should be free entry and exit, which is to say immigration, of course, can exist in both directions. But to join a society, you have to join the society. You have to become part of it and abide by, as Matisse put it, its requirements. I think extrapolating from participatory society to participatory world is conceptually not that difficult. The hard part is in the actual conditions that we're sitting in, having policies or demands or movements, etc., which actually move in the direction we want to go, which is not so easy. And I think we were vacillating between these two things in the discussion. The harder part is the strategy part, I think, by far. The complications, say, of moving between countries, if the countries are all participatory economic and participatory societies, the complications of that disappear. It's fine if people want to go. But when there is grave differences, now it's difficult. Anyway.
That's helpful. Before Sabina, I guess, so maybe a point I want to make that I wanted to say earlier, in terms of the issue of, the third thing, speed of adjustment, how do you move to this global equity stuff? And I put like a minimal principle, if all the places you're talking about are participatory, is that poverty is ended. That's immediate, right? And then you move to that. I like the way you put the goal. I'm going to add one complication in terms, so I do think there's right to move, but what about, for example, if, let's say there's an indigenous community that says, we want to just maintain among indigenous people. I think that, again, I don't have answers for. I think that does complicate it slightly in terms of what I was saying before. Savina?
Yeah, I'm just kind of struggling with a few things too. Like, people bring their culture and traditions with them, and they may want to be part of a participatory society, but like what I saw in France, Muslim people want to wear the hijab, and French people are saying, well, if you want to be part of France, you can't wear the hijab, right? All those kind of like cultural issues are going to, I think, come up even for us in a participatory society, because in effect, we're kind of talking about formation, right? Like, how do we socialize ourselves to be part of a participatory, like, I think we all want to be part of a participatory society, but there may be other people who don't, or maybe they just want part of it. So I don't know. I feel like there's some like nitty gritty stuff that will need to be ironed out. I'm also thinking about what you were saying, Michael. And then, Peter, about your point about how do we move to a point of global equity, like it seems really difficult to me, because we can't even come to agreement around the climate crisis, and that's the existential crisis of our time, right? And like when you see what happens at COP, which the Conference of Parties by the UN, and you see that it's being led by the fossil fuel company. I mean, so yeah, we've been sort of talking about it theoretically, participatory in the abstract, but in reality, like how are we going to deal with the fossil fuel industry? How are we going to deal with the fact that the US with its military has the largest ecological footprint on the right? We still have like power structures to contend with. So we're going to have to like fight these power structures, even as we're trying to create our own participatory society.
Thanks. Yeah. I think in terms of the talk, so it's not just totally in a good society. My intention was, maybe I didn't do so well. These are some principles that in terms of our organizing our strategy, we try to incorporate. That's how I thought of it. But I think that the thing that Michael and Matisse was saying about what do people have to accept if they move someplace? I think you gave really good examples. So I'm interested in that. But, Josie, do you want to go next?
Oh, I was inspired after Savina shared that of like the acute and pressing need of like climate crisis and how that's shifting some of the work that I'm focusing on right now, because I'm on the front lines in the healthcare situation here, at least in the Pacific Northwest. And it could be that I'm not seeing the full picture, but I'm genuinely worried about how quickly we're burning through healthcare workers. And I'm now focusing my research on figuring out how we support firefighters to sustain through that career, because I genuinely am concerned just on like a material infrastructure level. If we run out of firefighters, I think we might be kind of fucked. Things can literally burn down. And that might be helpful. That might be helpful in some ways. But it's sort of like these core essential things of ways that nature doesn't really care about our discussion about borders that can disrupt our foundation for civilization. We do have to seek to be in response to that and understanding of it, which I appreciate what Joe expressed, that at some point you got to kind of put how nature behaves first, instead of trying to impose a system onto nature where if it's going to be discordant, it's going to be a house of cards no matter what.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted the idea of there being like a full participatory world. I feel like you that for the most part, because I don't see how, like, if the USA is participatory society and Colombia isn't or something, and they're capitalists, I feel like us trying to transform their country to participatory society really much different than, say, like the state I live in Michigan. We become participatory and we try to change Wisconsin or something, which is another state in the US. Like, I don't, the only thing that I could see mostly is having like nations that are more like indigenous, like islands or something, where it's small enough where they don't need to have a participatory economy or participatory society in order for their system to be equitable and all that. Yeah, that's about it.
Sure. Yeah, this follows that a little bit, and it goes all the way back to, I think it was Matisse who was talking about when reparations were being discussed, and the question was, well, do you give reparations with conditions or without conditions? And that's a little bit like what you just said, Travis. And I think this is actually tricky. Okay, of course, ultimately, largesse doesn't have conditions attached to it. Generosity doesn't, justice doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. And also, we believe in self-management. So what the hell would it mean for the United States, say, a participatory society in the United States, to be saying, okay, you in Guatemala can have this much stuff, but you have to restructure the way we want you to restructure. Yeah, that sounds terrible, but now look at the other side of it. Let's say Guatemala has a dictator and a small ruling class, and if you give the stuff to the country, that group will decide how it's used. I think the historical tendency for how to deal with this is probably you give aid to groups that are fighting for change. And we look at that like maybe it's imposing our will on somebody else. Well, what do you think the left is doing? I mean, the left is a little bit, I don't know what word to use about this. We are trying to change the world. In the United States, say, we're trying to change the United States. if we're fighting against a war, we're trying to change that. If there are people who are for the war or who are for the conditions in the United States, we are not just saying do what you want. We're saying we want it done this other way. But we're trying to develop a mass movement to accomplish that, not to do it through a leader. Okay, that sounds groovy again, but if the United States is participatory society and Chavez gets elected in Venezuela, and there's a whole lot of schmucks in Venezuela also, and so we give aid to Venezuela because we hope it goes through Chavez to the people, and then next door there's, you know, a dictator, and we don't give aid. These are real, this is what I meant when I said earlier, strategy is the hard thing. You know, if everybody is groovy, if everybody is participatory society, it just disappears. But in the short run, the problem is the left wants to attain a different system, a different world, a different society. The left also does not want to impose upon others. Those two things can be a bit in contradiction. And when they are, the trick is, how do you do something that imposes without becoming authoritarian and a dictator? Not how do you just smile at the people who want to do things, who want to be racist or who want to, you know, be sexist. This is a tricky strategic issue, I think. But it's one that has to be challenged. And it is all the time.
I would respond, but Matisse, do you have your hand up? I couldn't tell. Okay, so I guess, Michael, so let me try to answer a little bit some of your things. You know, the real questions. Okay, so for example, with the global debt, I try to argue that the demand should be talking about now, not just in the future, to cancel the debt. And even if it's the Guatemalan dictatorship or the, you know, Uribe in Colombia next to Venezuela, it still gives the movements there more of a chance to have some. So I think that's still, you know, it's not totally dependent on that. But then also thinking about social movements here. So I was thinking, I was very involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And it's a question, do you? So the group that was most well known in the US and around the world was the ANC, right? The group that eventually takes power, that was led by Nelson Mandela. There was another pretty strong group called the PAC, Pan-African Congress, that was much more nationalist, more anti-white, and had some support too. So the question is, do you only support the ANC? Do you support both? So, and then there were groups that were much more right-wing, okay? That seemed easy. So I think in terms of movements, I think from this discussion, and Mike, what you said too, and others also, I think there's a danger, you know, of us picking who the revolutionary group is. Even if we're talking about left groups, I think when groups are clearly not part in any kind of way of any kind of support, you don't support them. It doesn't mean you attack them, but I think in terms of solidarity, you do support movements, you know, that you have affinity with. But the danger is, I think you got to be pretty broad, and if there are more than one group in general, support more than one. Any okay, we're kind of at time. Anybody else, particularly people who haven't spoken yet, want to add anything or share? And I hope this was somewhat helpful. It was helpful to me, and I apologize again for some of the stuff at the beginning.
Michael?
Yeah, just as an example of the downside, donors to the left in the US at various times have basically said to the left, yeah, we'll give you money, do this. And do this could be, for example, don't support Palestine. And it was that during the no nukes movement, there was a gigantic demonstration in New York, and you know, Cora Weiss, Peter. Cora Weiss basically got up and said, don't let him speak if you want to keep getting my money. Basically, that was the essence of it.
The 80 million people.
Huh? What?
The freeze, 1 million people, 82. You're right.
Yeah, it's a gigantic demonstration, and so that happens on a smaller scale sometimes too. So that's an example of the bad, ostensible goodwill trying to impose ostensibly good outcomes, and they're not good in that case, and it's also authoritarian. But on the other hand, you know, Peter's at the demonstration and wants there to be support for Palestine. It's a tricky set of issues. Maybe the real solution is that there's a mechanism that's none of this discussion has discussed institutions, right? So what institutional changes do there have to be, for example, internationally, for there to be better trade relations that put more of the benefit on the third world? I mean, just saying that should happen is basically saying, well, each country should decide to agree. Maybe there should be a set of institutions that intervene in that kind of thing. Maybe if there's reparations, don't call it reparations. Maybe if there's societal building funds, I don't know. Maybe there should be international institutions that channel that, and therefore have the roots of those institutions and the power in those institutions are obviously in the global South. So there are institutional questions, not just sort of, and a real movement demand moves toward the outcome by way of establishing the institutions and the conditions that make the outcome possible. And Savina, of course, all this rests on beating, and it's literally beating, removing the power from and taking the wealth away from the power centers that block all this. And I think you're right. That's a prerequisite, which means probably revolutions within countries are a prerequisite for ample progress between countries. It's hard for me to imagine a revolution any place in the world succeeding as long as the United States has the relative military power that it has. I mean, that's a sickening thought. But real solidarity with people abroad is winning here and removing us as the obstacle, which we are. Or at least it seems that way to me.
Anybody else? Closing comments? Joe?
Yeah, I'd just like to note that obviously a lot of work went into this session, and thanks to everyone who did all that work. And let's have more of these meetings on various topics. More work for the laborers.
More people attending.
Yeah, thanks again. I said I did put effort into this, even though some of it could have been clearer. And yeah, I guess, yeah, I'm not sure if I agree with Michael about revolution being first here. Certainly, I think revolutionary change is needed all over. I think other countries are closer to it in terms of people's consciousness, but I know that's not enough. But I think for RU and both individually, people here, all of us, really bringing this global focus, given this obscene inequality, not just within nations, but between nations. I mean, I think when you think about it, it's just so disgusting and horrible. So I think bringing that and fighting that, both the war, the militarism, but also the economic forces that reproduce this inequality, it's just, I think, should be more of our work than it has been up to now. And I think the climate is certainly one major way to do that.
Yeah, if there are no additional comments, I suggest we officially end the session.